Kale had stopped counting salvage runs somewhere around the third year. The work required precision, navigating debris fields, cataloging technological remnants, interfacing with automated recovery systems, but not presence. He could perform every task while maintaining the comfortable distance he'd cultivated between his body and his awareness of it. The contract came through standard channels. Transportation to Lear space, duration unspecified, compensation substantial enough to suggest either desperation or deception. The intermediary's transmission included medical waivers he'd never seen before, language about bioelectric compatibility, and extended physical interface protocols. He signed without reading past the first page. His quarters on the transport vessel were smaller than the salvage ship's cargo hold. He spent the 3-week journey in a routine that required no decision-making, maintenance checks at SAO 600, meal rations at prescribed intervals, sleep cycles calibrated to match the destination's rotational period. The other passengers, a trading delegation from one of the inner systems, attempted conversation during the first week. He responded with the minimum courtesy required, and they stopped trying. The ship's AI announced approach to the vestry on the morning of the 22nd day. Kyle watched the structure materialize on the view screen, a sprawling architectural formation that seemed to grow organically from the asteroid it had consumed, surfaces smooth and slightly luminous like bone that had never stopped living. He felt nothing looking at it. That was normal now. The docking procedure took 40 minutes. When the airlock finally opened, 3 Lear stood waiting in the receiving chamber. Their bodies were taller than human baseline, willowy in a way that suggested either fragility or a different relationship with gravity. Translucent skin revealed the constant pulse of bioelectric activity beneath, networks of light tracing patterns he couldn't quite follow. The central figure stepped forward. Kyle, not a question. Her voice had a harmonic quality, as if multiple frequencies were speaking simultaneously. I am Silmer, caretaker of this vestry. He nodded, the gesture feeling mechanical. The contract specified immediate commencement. Something flickered across her face, surprise perhaps or disappointment. Her companions exchanged glances he didn't try to interpret. You were informed of the nature of the work. Physical contact, extended duration, bioelectric interaction. He recited the technical terms from the contract. I'm cleared for all specified protocols. Silmer was silent for a long moment, her internal light pulsing in patterns that might have been communication with the others or simply autonomic processing. Finally, she gestured toward a corridor branching off from the receiving chamber. Then we should begin. The treatment chamber was smaller than he'd expected, walls curved and slightly warm to the touch, as if the architecture itself was living tissue. Silmer dismissed her companions and stood motionless in the center of the room, regarding him with an intensity that felt clinical. The Traverse failed 17 cycles ago, she said. We are diminishing. Thought becomes slower. Connections between concepts fail to form. We continue, but we are not what we were. Kyle unbuttoned his jacket, folded it with practiced precision, placed it on the single bench that grew from the wall like an afterthought. The contract mentioned cognitive restoration. Your species generates electrical noise, chaos. Our biology evolved to synchronize, to harmonize. But synchronization has become stagnation. She moved closer, and he became aware of the faint scent emanating from her skin, something like ozone and vegetation, foreign but not unpleasant. We need disruption. Where do you want me? The bluntness of the question seemed to catch her off guard. She blinked, the translucent membranes moving horizontally across eyes that held too many colors to name. Your hand. Against my sternum, where the primary neural cluster concentrates. He stepped into her personal space without hesitation, raising his right hand. She caught his wrist before contact, her fingers cool and slightly rough, the grip carrying surprising strength. This will be uncomfortable for both of us, she said quietly. Your nervous system will feel the pull. Mine will feel the interference. Neither experience maps cleanly to pain, but neither is pleasant. I understand. She released his wrist. He pressed his palm flat against her chest, just below where a human's collarbones would meet. Her skin was cooler than he'd anticipated, the texture somewhere between silk and scales. He felt the neural cluster beneath, a dense concentration of bioelectric activity pulsing against his hand like a second heartbeat. Then her body tried to synchronize with his. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming, a pulling feeling, as if something invisible had latched onto his nervous system and was attempting to drag it into alignment with hers. His electrical patterns, normally chaotic and barely noticed, suddenly became conscious and wrong, too fast and irregular, firing in bursts that her biology couldn't match, but couldn't stop trying to match. Silma made a sound that wasn't quite a gasp. Her free hand shot out to brace against his shoulder, fingers digging into the muscle there. He felt her neural cluster surge beneath his palm, activity spiking and fragmenting as it tried to process input it had never been designed to handle. How long? His voice came out rougher than intended. 10 minutes. The words seemed to cost her effort. For the initial session. He nodded and stayed absolutely still, his hand steady against her chest even as he felt her body shudder with the strain of metabolizing his chaos. Her breathing accelerated, the rhythm erratic, and he became aware of other responses, temperature increasing where they touched, muscle tension traveling up her arm from where she gripped his shoulder, small involuntary movements as her nervous system fought to adapt. The 10 minutes felt longer than the 3-week journey. When Silma finally stepped back, breaking contact, they both swayed slightly. She caught herself on the wall, chest rising and falling in deep pulls of air. Kyle remained standing through pure discipline, ignoring the strange hollowness in his nervous system where her pull had been. That was... She trailed off, clearly searching for language. Effective. He retrieved his jacket, fingers moving through the familiar action of putting it back on. When's the next session? They fell into a schedule. Every morning at what the vestry's timekeeping designated as 6th hour, Kyle returned to the treatment chamber. Silma was always waiting, and the sessions extended incrementally. 15 minutes, then 20, then 30, as her tolerance increased and his endurance proved deeper than projected. He learned the architecture of the vestry through repetition. The corridor from his assigned quarters to the treatment chamber, the communal space where he occasionally saw other Lear moving in small groups, their bioluminescence dimmed and sluggish compared to Silma's gradually brightening patterns. He learned which surfaces were grown rather than built, which sections of the structure hummed with residual energy from the dead traverse. On the 8th day, Silma spoke during contact for the first time. "You never ask questions." Her voice vibrated through the point where his forearm pressed against her shoulder blade. The contact expanded to include broader receptor fields along her spine. "About us, the Traverse, why your biology matters. It's in the contract materials. You read technical specifications, not history, not who we were." He kept his breathing steady, focusing on the sensation of her bioelectric draw intensifying along his nervous system, the way it created a peculiar tension in his muscles. "Who you were doesn't change what you need now." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft hum of the vestry's autonomous systems and her increasingly labored breathing. He felt her neural activity surge beneath his touch, thoughts moving faster than they had in previous sessions, making connections her biology had been starving for. "You're very good at being useful," she said finally. Something in her tone suggested the observation wasn't entirely complimentary. After that session, he returned to his quarters and stood under the hygiene shower for longer than necessary, letting the water pressure work at muscles that ached in ways that weren't quite pain. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had performed countless salvage operations, interfaced with alien technologies, repaired failing systems in hard vacuum, and tried to remember the last time they'd touched another person before coming here. He couldn't. The Council of Remnants summoned him on the 16th day. They gathered in a chamber that must have once held hundreds, the empty space around them more eloquent than words about what they'd lost. 7 Lear, their bioluminescence noticeably dimmer than Silma's, arranged in a semicircle that felt both formal and desperate. "The treatment is succeeding," the one who introduced herself as Council Orveth said without preamble. "Silma shows cognitive restoration beyond our projections. We wish to expand the protocol to additional subjects." Kyle stood with his hands clasped behind his back, the posture automatic. "How many?" "Initially, 4 more. If your endurance allows, we will continue expansion." A pause. "The contract permits modification of treatment parameters with mutual consent." "I consent." Orveth's bioluminescence flickered. "You don't wish to know the parameters first?" You need more contact time distributed across more individuals. The mathematics are obvious. He met her gaze without discomfort. I can handle it. The silence that followed felt weighted. One of the other council members leaned toward Orveth, tendrils brushing in what was clearly communication, though no sound accompanied it. Orveth's expression, if the subtle shifts in bioluminescence and muscle tension could be called expression, suggested something complicated. Very well. We will establish a rotation schedule. Sessions will begin tomorrow. The new rotation required 12 hours of contact daily, split between 5 Lear in varying durations. Kyle adjusted his routine accordingly: minimal sleep cycle, condensed meal periods, no recreational time. The work was manageable once he stopped thinking of it as contact with people and started thinking of it as system maintenance. The Lear responded differently to his presence. Orveth approached each session like combat, her failing neural architecture fighting his chaos even as it desperately needed the stimulation. Another Mirlay maintained analytical distance that made the sessions feel purely transactional, exactly what Kyle preferred. A younger one named Theris couldn't hide his discomfort with the intimacy required, his bioluminescence dimming whenever contact extended past an hour. And Silma, whose sessions still anchored morning and evening, began asking questions again. "You never remove your jacket," Silma observed during their morning session, her hand resting against his back, where the primary receptor field ran parallel to his spine. Even when the temperature rises during extended contact. Kyle kept his eyes on the curved wall ahead, counting the subtle variations in the organic architecture. Professional habit. Salvage work requires protective gear. This is... Her fingers moved slightly, not quite exploring, adjusting contact points with clinical precision. Not that. No. The session continued in silence, but he felt her attention differently now, not just monitoring his bioelectric output, but observing him as something other than a functional component. It created an awareness he didn't want, a consciousness of his body in space, of the heat building between them where skin met skin, of his own pulse accelerating when her touch lingered. After that session, he found himself unable to immediately return to his quarters. He stood in the corridor outside the treatment chamber, one hand pressed against the cool wall, trying to identify the sensation coiling in his chest. Not quite discomfort, not quite its opposite. The vestry's population had begun to notice him. He saw it in the way their bioluminescence brightened slightly when he passed, in small groups that paused their sluggish communication to track his movement. Theris had mentioned it during their last session, that others were asking about the human, about whether the treatment slots might expand further, about what it felt like to be touched by chaos. "They think you're saving us," Theris had said, his young voice carrying uncertainty. "Are you?" Kale hadn't answered. On the 23rd day, the schedule expanded again. 9 Lear in rotation now, sessions extending to 14 hours total. His body adapted with the same mechanical efficiency it had always shown: reduced sleep requirement, optimized nutrient intake, cardiovascular system adjusting to sustained bioelectric draw. But something else was changing, slower and harder to catalogue. He began noticing details that served no functional purpose. The way Mirlay's bioluminescence pulsed in Fibonacci sequences during deep processing. How Orveth's grip tightened fractionally when her neural architecture achieved breakthrough moments. The specific rhythm of Silma's breathing when contact pushed past 3 hours, and exhaustion began to override her careful control. He noticed his own responses too. The acceleration of his heart rate that had nothing to do with bioelectric draw. The attention his nervous system paid to the texture of their skin, the small variations in temperature, the precise points where their bodies aligned. The way his thoughts would linger on previous sessions, instead of compartmentalizing them as completed tasks. It concerned him, distantly, the way a salvager might note a minor system malfunction that hadn't yet impacted performance. Worth monitoring. Not yet worth addressing. Silma's sessions continued to extend. 5 hours became routine, 6 became possible. On the 31st day, the council approved a trial of sustained contact beyond any previous duration, 8 hours minimum, with extension if both participants remained stable. They began at dawn, measured by the vestry's arbitrary designation. Kale had learned to read the subtle signs of Silma's preparation. the way she regulated her bioluminescence to baseline before contact, the particular stillness she cultivated, the careful positioning of supplemental nutrient supplies within reach. "If you need to stop," she said, "you tell me." "I will." The lie came easily. He never told anyone to stop. The first hours passed in familiar territory. Her hands against his shoulders and spine, his forearms providing contact along her primary receptor fields, the sustained pull on his nervous system becoming white noise he could operate through. They'd developed an efficiency over the weeks, optimal positioning, minimal adjustment, maximum bioelectric transfer, but hour 4 brought them into unmapped duration, and his body began signaling distress in ways he couldn't entirely suppress. Muscle tremors in his legs, difficulty regulating core temperature, a hollowness spreading through his nervous system as her draw intensified, pulling harder to maintain the same level of stimulation. Silmer felt it. He knew she felt it because her bioluminescence flickered with what he'd learned to recognize as concern. Her grip shifted, trying to redistribute the load, but that only increased their contact surface area and amplified the effect. "Kyle." Her voice vibrated through the points where they touched. "Your electrical signature is destabilizing." "I'm aware." The words came out rougher than intended, his throat dry despite the hydration breaks. "Protocol says." "I know what protocol says." She was silent for a long moment, her neural activity visible beneath translucent skin, racing through calculations and considerations he couldn't follow. Then her draw intensified fractionally, pulling harder at his nervous system, and he felt his body respond with a shudder he couldn't quite control. "Why?" The question emerged quiet, almost lost beneath the hum of the vestry systems. He didn't pretend not to understand. "Because you need it." "That's not a reason to hurt yourself, isn't it?" He kept his eyes forward, focusing on the wall's subtle architecture, anything but the awareness of her body against his, the intimacy of this shared strain. "You're recovering. All of you are. The cognitive measurements show it. That's what the contract specifies. Restoration of function. I'm functional." Her hands moved to his face, turning his head until he had no choice but to meet her eyes. The contact wasn't part of the treatment protocol. It was something else entirely, and they both knew it. You don't eat unless scheduled. You don't sleep unless required for performance. You've lost. She paused, bioluminescence pulsing with something that looked like distress. "I don't know how much weight because humans aren't part of our medical database, but enough that I can feel different bones beneath your skin than I could 30 days ago. I'm within operational parameters. You're disappearing." Her voice carried an edge he'd never heard before. "You perform this work as if you're not present for it, as if you've found a way to be useful while remaining absent from your own body." The observation struck something he'd kept carefully buried. He felt it try to surface, actual emotion, actual presence, and shut it down with practiced efficiency. "The session isn't complete." Silmer's hands remained on his face for another moment, her touch carrying a weight that had nothing to do with bioelectric transfer. Then she released him and stepped back, breaking contact entirely. "It is now." Silmer refused to schedule their next session. Kyle stood in the treatment chamber at the designated hour, waiting while the minutes accumulated into a certainty she wasn't coming. The other sessions continued, Orveth, Mirlay, Theris, and the expanding roster of Lear showing marked improvement, but Silmer's slot remained conspicuously empty. On the third day of her absence, he found himself wandering sections of the vestry he'd never explored, walking without purpose through corridors that curved in ways human architecture wouldn't. He passed Lear in small groups, their bioluminescence brighter than it had been weeks ago, their movements less sluggish, evidence of success, evidence that the work mattered. He felt nothing. That wasn't quite true. He felt the hollow space where Silmer's bioelectric draw usually anchored his mornings and evenings, felt the absence of her questions, her increasingly difficult observations, the way her presence had begun to penetrate the careful distance he maintained between himself and everything. He found her in what the Lear called a contemplation chamber, a small spherical room with walls that shifted through subtle bioluminescence patterns. She sat in the center, legs folded beneath her in a position human anatomy couldn't quite replicate, her internal light dimmed to almost nothing. "You shouldn't be here," she said without turning. "This space is for—" "You're declining again." The interruption was automatic, the observation clinical. Without consistent contact, the cognitive restoration will degrade. 3 days of missed sessions represent significant treatment interruption. I know. Then why? Because I don't know how to touch you anymore without feeling like I'm consuming you. The words emerged flat, exhausted. And I can't determine if that concern is my restored cognitive plasticity, enabling actual ethical reasoning, or just another form of the self-absorption we fell into before the traverse failed. Kale remained standing in the entrance, unsure of the protocol for this kind of conversation. The treatment is working, you said so yourself. Clear evidence of... You didn't eat yesterday. She finally turned to face him, bioluminescence pulsing with something too complex to name. Theris mentioned it. Said you'd come to your session with him directly from Orveth's, skipped the scheduled meal period entirely. He was worried enough to check the communal nutrition records. You haven't consumed food in 37 hours. I wasn't hungry. Your species requires regular caloric intake. The medical specifications are clear. She unfolded from her seated position with fluid grace, moving closer but not touching. You're not maintaining yourself. You're just operating. Like a system running on minimal power, allocating all resources to the primary function. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't confirm what she was observing. Tell me why you're really here, Silma said quietly. Not in the vestry, that's contract work, but why you took this contract specifically, why extended physical contact with a dying species seemed like acceptable work for someone who clearly finds all contact uncomfortable. I don't find it uncomfortable. You find it irrelevant. She moved closer still, close enough that he could feel the ambient warmth of her bioluminescence. You've perfected the ability to be touched without being present for it. It's remarkable, actually. And terrible. The words settled into his chest like stones. He wanted to deny them, wanted to explain that efficiency wasn't absence, that professional distance was different from disconnection. But standing there, faced with her careful observation, he couldn't quite locate the lie that would make the distinction. I should go, he said instead. Kyle. She caught his wrist as he turned, the contact sending familiar electricity through his nervous system. What happened to you? Before this? Before you became so good at being used? He pulled free, gentle but definite. That's not part of the contract. Kale couldn't sleep. The hollow feeling had expanded beyond his nervous system into something larger, something that filled his quarters and made lying still impossible. He found himself walking the vestry's corridors again, navigating by the soft bioluminescence of the architecture itself. He discovered the archive by accident, a chamber deep in the structure's oldest section, walls lined with what looked like crystallized memories, each one pulsing with faint internal light. A single Lear stood among them, elderly by the dimness of their bioluminescence, moving carefully between the crystals. The traverse, the Lear said without preamble, gesturing to the archive, every communion, every shared thought from 17,000 cycles of collective consciousness. All that remains now are these echoes. Kale moved closer to examine the nearest crystal. Inside, lights moved in patterns that suggested communication, connection, belonging. You're the human, not a question. The one helping us remember how to think. I provide bioelectric stimulation. Whether that constitutes help is definitional. The archivist made a sound that might have been laughter. Silmar said you were precise with language. They selected a crystal from a lower shelf, cradled it carefully. This is from the first communion after the traverse collapsed. Confusion, terror, the sudden isolation of minds that had never been alone. Some of us went into stasis rather than face it. Why are you telling me this? Because you look at Silmar the way we looked at the traverse after it died. Like something essential has been severed. The archivist replaced the crystal with deliberate care. Like you're still alive, but no longer remember why that matters. Kyle turned away from the archive, from the weight of thousands of cycles of connection crystallized into evidence of what he'd never had. I should return to quarters. She's in love with you, you know. The words stopped him at the entrance. Not in any way your species would recognize, perhaps. But she thinks about you constantly now. Wonders where you are when you're not in session. Watches for you in the communal spaces. Her neural patterns have reshaped themselves around anticipating your presence. That's not... He searched for the right word. Appropriate. She needs the treatment. That's not the same as needing me, isn't it? The archivist's bioluminescence pulsed with gentle amusement. The Traverse taught us that consciousness emerges from connection. That we are who we are because of what we share with others. You've become her connection, human. The pattern her thoughts follow. That's as close to love as we understand it. She doesn't know me. Does anyone? The question hung in the air, unanswerable. Kale left the archive and found himself outside Silmer's private quarters, smaller than his own, surfaces covered with growing things, plants that bioluminesced in soft colors. She sat by the window that looked out into the asteroid field, her reflection ghost-like in the transparent material. She turned when he entered, surprise flickering across her features. Kale, it's third hour. You should be... I don't know how to do this. The words emerged before he could stop them, raw and unrefined. The work I can do. I'm good at being useful. But whatever you're asking for, presence, honesty, actual connection, I don't have that. I don't think I've ever had it. Silmer stood slowly, moving toward him with careful precision. What happened? Nothing. The word came out harsh. That's the problem. Nothing happened. No trauma, no tragedy, just a gradual realization that I could perform all the functions of living without ever being fully present for any of them. And that was easier, cleaner, less complicated. And now? Now I'm here, and you're asking me to be present while you touch me, to feel it, to acknowledge that this matters. He met her eyes, forcing himself to hold the contact. I don't know if I can. She reached up, fingers brushing his jaw with feather-light pressure. Can I try something? He nodded, not trusting his voice. Silmer guided him to sit on the floor, then positioned herself facing him, knees nearly touching. She took both his hands, placing them palm down on her thighs, where receptor fields pulsed beneath translucent skin. Then she mirrored the position, her hands resting on his legs, the contact warm and steady. No draw, she said quietly. No treatment protocol. Just this. Just being here together. The absence of her bioelectric pull felt strange, like a weight removed he hadn't consciously registered carrying. Without the distraction of maintaining output, he became acutely aware of other sensations. The texture of her skin against his palms, slightly rough like sand-smoothed stone. The warmth building where they touched. The rhythm of her breathing, slower than human baseline but steady. The way her bioluminescence pulsed in time with his heartbeat, as if her body was still trying to synchronize with his, even without active draw. What do you feel? She asked. He wanted to say nothing. Wanted to retreat into the comfortable numbness that had carried him through years of salvage work, through contracts and deployments, and the efficient performance of tasks that required no emotional investment. But sitting there, hands on her body and hers on his, the lie wouldn't come. Scared, he said finally. I feel scared. The council approved a new treatment protocol on the 45th day. Sustained contact sessions exceeding 12 hours, involving multiple Lear simultaneously to maximize cognitive restoration across the population. The mathematics were undeniable. More contact meant faster recovery for more individuals. The fact that it would push Kale past any reasonable limit was simply another variable in the equation. Silmer voted against it. She was the only one. So who can't ask this, she said, standing before the council in formal challenge posture. He's already operating beyond sustainable parameters. Extending duration while increasing the number of simultaneous draws will restore function to 9 additional Lear, who are currently declining towards stasis, Orveth interrupted. The human has demonstrated exceptional endurance. His nervous system adapts to increased load with remarkable efficiency. His nervous system is being damaged by increased load. Silmer's bioluminescence flared with uncharacteristic intensity. I can feel it during contact, the way his electrical patterns fragment under sustained draw, the way his body starts to... The human has already consented. Orveth gestured to the documentation. His signature is on the protocol modification. This discussion is complete. Silmer found Kale in the treatment chamber, preparing for the first 12-hour multi-participant session. 3 other Lear were already there. Mirle, Theris, and one of the newer additions to treatment, their collective bioluminescence casting the room in complex patterns. "You signed without telling me," she said, voice carefully controlled. "It's my contract to sign." He was arranging the specialized equipment for multi-point contact, his movements precise and professional. "The work is manageable. The work is destroying you." That's dramatic. That's observational. She moved between him and the other Lear, forcing him to acknowledge her. "You weigh 15% less than you did 30 days ago. Your hands shake after sessions. Yesterday you nearly collapsed during the transition between Orveth and Merle. I caught myself." "Kyle." She reached for him, then stopped, hand hovering in the space between them. "Please." The 12-hour session began with clinical efficiency. Kyle positioned himself at the center. 4 Lear arranged around him, contact points optimized for maximum bioelectric transfer. His forearms against Silmer's receptor fields, his back against Merle's, his hands providing contact for the other two. The combined draw hit his nervous system like a wave, 4 different patterns pulling simultaneously, his chaotic electrical signature attempting to stimulate 4 sets of failing neural architecture at once. His body responded with immediate distress, heart rate spiking, muscle tremors, temperature regulation failing, but he'd learned to operate through distress. Hour 3 brought the first fragmenting of his electrical patterns. He felt it like static in his consciousness, thoughts becoming difficult to hold together, the boundary between his nervous system and theirs beginning to blur. Silmer's grip tightened on his forearms, her concern visible in the rapid pulsing of her bioluminescence. Hour 6 removed his ability to track time clearly. Everything became sensation without context. The pull on his nervous system, the heat of multiple bodies pressed against his, the sound of breathing that might have been his or theirs or everyone's. His hands had gone numb an hour ago, or maybe longer. Time felt negotiable. "Kyle." Silmer's voice penetrated the fog. "Say something. I need to know you're still present." He tried to respond, but the words tangled before reaching his mouth. The effort of forming language while maintaining electrical output, while managing 4 separate bioelectric interfaces, exceeded his remaining cognitive resources. "That's it." Silmer released contact, stepping back. "Session terminated." "No." The word came out slurred. "Contract specifies—" "I don't care what the contract specifies." She was pulling the others off him too, breaking connections one by one despite their protests. "You're fragmenting. Another hour and we don't know if your neural patterns will reintegrate properly." Kyle tried to stand, tried to argue, but his legs wouldn't support him. He felt himself falling, felt Silmer catch him before he hit the floor, felt the world tilt sideways and fade into something that wasn't quite unconsciousness, but wasn't presence either. He woke in medical observation. Silmer, sitting vigil beside the bed form that had grown from the floor to support him. The room was dim, her bioluminescence providing the only light. 7 hours, she said quietly. "You were non-responsive for 7 hours. Your nervous system is still showing fragmentation patterns. The session is cancelled. All future multi-participant sessions are cancelled." She leaned forward, and he saw something in her face he'd never seen before. Grief. "I told the council that if they attempt to schedule another one, I will physically prevent you from attending. You can't do that. Watch me." Her hand found his, fingers interweaving carefully. "You matter, Kyle. Not your function, not your utility, you. And I refuse to participate in your systematic self-destruction anymore, even if it means my own decline." Something in his chest cracked open. A pressure he hadn't known he was carrying suddenly released. He felt it all at once, the exhaustion, the damage, the weeks of operating past his limits, the loneliness he'd been performing around, and beneath it all, the terrifying realization that Silmer was right. He'd been disappearing, gradually, methodically, professionally disappearing into the work until nothing remained but function. "I don't know how to stop," he said, and his voice broke on the admission. Silmer's hand tightened on his. "Then let me help you learn." Recovery took longer than the damage. Silmer enforced rest protocols with the same precision she'd once applied to treatment sessions. Mandatory nutrition periods, sleep cycles, complete cessation of bioelectric contact until his electrical patterns restabilized. Kyle resisted at first, arguing about contract obligations and the vestry's needs. But his body made resistance impossible. The fragmentation had gone deeper than either of them had realized, his nervous system struggling to reintegrate patterns that had been pulled in too many directions for too long. "Talk to me," Silmer said on the third day of enforced recovery, sitting beside him in the medical observation room. "Not about work, not about protocol, just talk. I don't know what you want me to say. Anything real." She shifted closer, her presence warm and steady. "Tell me about before salvage work, before you became so efficient at being absent." He stared at the ceiling, tracking the subtle shifts in the organic architecture's bioluminescence. "I had a family once, parents, a sister. They weren't bad people, weren't cruel or neglectful, just ordinary. What happened to them? Nothing. They're still there, I assume, on the colony where I grew up." He felt the old numbness trying to resurface, the comfortable distance. "I left when I was 17. Haven't spoken to them since. Why? Because they kept asking me how I felt, what I wanted, what made me happy." The words came slowly, dredged from places he'd sealed off. "And I never had answers. I could perform happiness, could simulate engagement, but actually feeling it, actually being present enough to want things, that was always just beyond reach." Silmer was quiet for a long moment. "And you thought that made you broken, doesn't it? It makes you human." She took his hand, her touch gentle. "Humans experience disconnection, numbness, the inability to feel what you're supposed to feel. It's documented in your medical literature, your art, your philosophy. You're not unique in this, Kale, you're just alone with it." The observation settled into him with unexpected weight. He'd spent years believing his disconnection made him fundamentally different, fundamentally wrong. The possibility that it was simply a variation of a common human experience that felt simultaneously relieving and devastating. "I don't know how to fix it," he admitted. "Maybe it's not about fixing." Silmar shifted, bringing herself into his line of sight. "Maybe it's about learning to be present, even when presence is uncomfortable, even when it means feeling things you don't have names for." She stood then, extending her hand. "Come with me." She led him through corridors he'd never explored, deep into the vestry's oldest sections, until they reached a chamber filled with growing things, plants and fungi native to Lear worlds, their bioluminescence creating a forest of soft light. "After the traverse failed," Silmer said, settling onto the moss-like ground cover, "we had to relearn how to exist as individuals. It was terrifying. We'd never been alone before, never had to contain our own thoughts without the collective to help process them." Kale sat beside her, careful not to initiate contact. "How did you manage it?" "We didn't. Not at first." She gestured to the growing things around them. "We regressed, became reactive instead of cognitive. Some of us barely moved for cycles, paralyzed by the experience of isolated consciousness. Others became obsessive, fixating on single tasks to avoid confronting the emptiness. And now we're learning that maybe isolation isn't empty. Maybe individual consciousness has value we never recognized because we never had to rely on it." She turned to face him fully. "You taught me that. I didn't teach you anything, You showed me what it means to be truly alone," she interrupted gently, "and still choose to connect. Still choose to be present for someone else even when presence costs you everything. That's not emptiness, Kale. That's courage." He felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he couldn't name, but also couldn't dismiss. "I wasn't being courageous. I was just doing the work. The work required your body. You gave me your presence." Her hand found his again, the contact now familiar in its warmth. "Do you understand the difference?" He thought about the sessions, the hours of contact, the way she'd started asking questions, observing him, seeing past the professional distance to something underneath, the way he'd started noticing her in return, not just as a patient, but as a consciousness, a person, someone whose thoughts and observations and careful attention had begun to matter in ways he hadn't experienced before. "I think I'm beginning to," he said. The council called an emergency session on the 53rd day. Kale's bioelectric patterns had stabilized enough for him to attend, though Silmer insisted on accompanying him, despite the irregularity of a caretaker serving as advocate. Orveth spoke for the council with her customary directness. "The multi-participant protocol has been formally suspended. Analysis of the human's neural damage suggests continued high-intensity treatment carries unacceptable risk. Relief flooded through Kyle, followed immediately by confusion about why relief felt so overwhelming. However, Orveth continued, standard individual sessions will resume immediately. 26 Lear remain in active decline. Without continued treatment, they will reach cognitive stasis within 15 cycles. No. Silmer's response was immediate. He hasn't fully recovered from... The human's recovery status is documented, Orveth interrupted. His electrical patterns show acceptable reintegration. He is cleared for standard protocol resumption. Silmer's bioluminescence flared with anger. Acceptable reintegration isn't full recovery. His nervous system is still... Silmer. Kale's voice cut through the argument. I can speak for myself. She turned to him, conflict visible in every line of her body. You'll consent. You always consent, regardless of cost. Maybe. He stood facing the council with the same precision he'd once used for contract negotiations. But this time, I want something in return. Orveth's bioluminescence shifted to something approximating curiosity. The compensation structure is already established in, I don't want more money. Kyle kept his voice level. I want treatment limits, maximum session duration, 4 hours, maximum daily contact time, 8 hours, mandatory rest periods between sessions, and I want final authority over session termination. If I say it stops, regardless of protocol specifications. Silence filled the council chamber. Silmer's hand found his, her grip tight with something that felt like pride. These limitations will significantly reduce treatment efficiency, Orveth said finally. Yes, they'll also reduce the likelihood that I become permanently neurologically damaged. He met her eyes without flinching. I'm willing to help. I'm willing to provide the bioelectric stimulation you need, but I'm not willing to disappear in the process anymore. More silence. Then Orveth's bioluminescence pulsed in a pattern he'd learned to recognize as resigned acceptance. The modifications are approved. Standard protocol resumes tomorrow at 6th hour with specified limitations. The sessions felt different now. Kyle couldn't quite articulate what had changed. The bioelectric exchange remained the same, his nervous system still providing the chaos their failing neural architectures needed. But something in the quality of contact had shifted. He was present for it now. Consciously, deliberately present. He felt Silmer's body against his and acknowledged the sensation instead of cataloguing it as data. Noticed the warmth, the texture, the way her breathing synchronized with his during extended contact. Let himself be aware that this mattered, that she mattered, that the hours spent in careful proximity were creating something beyond therapeutic intervention. You're different, she observed during their 5th session under the new protocol. Your electrical patterns have changed. Not just recovered, actually different than before the fragmentation. Is that a problem? No. Her hand moved along his forearm, fingers tracing the receptor points that had become intimately familiar to both of them. It's interesting. Your chaos used to feel purely reactive. Now there's something more deliberate about it, like you're choosing the disruption instead of just generating it. He considered that, turning the observation over in his newly responsive consciousness. Maybe I am. The weeks accumulated into something resembling normalcy. Sessions in the morning and evening, bracketing a day that now included actual meal periods, rest cycles, even occasional wandering through the vestry's gardens and archives. He learned the names of the other Lear in treatment, learned to recognize individual bioluminescence patterns, learned that Theris composed something approximating music when his cognitive function was running optimally. And he learned Silmer, the way she processed difficult concepts by dimming her bioluminescence and going very still, the particular rhythm of her breathing when contact pushed past 3 hours and exhaustion began to set in, the fact that she maintained a small garden in her quarters specifically because the growing things reminded her that life continued even when everything else failed. On the 67th day during their evening session, she asked, "When your contract ends, what will you do?" The question caught him off guard. He'd stopped thinking of the work as temporary, stopped tracking the days against some distant completion date. "I don't know." "You could stay." Her voice carried careful neutrality. "The vestry has resources. We could establish a permanent arrangement." You'd have value here beyond just the treatment. Someone who understands both human and Lear systems, who could help us navigate integration with other species as we recover. You're asking me to stay. I'm asking if you would want to. She met his eyes, her bioluminescence pulsing with something vulnerable. Not because we need you, because I want you to. There's a difference. There was. And acknowledging that difference required acknowledging that he wanted it too, wanted the structure of this place, the daily sessions, the slow accumulation of connection with beings who had somehow learned to see past his careful absence to something underneath. Wanted Silmar's presence, her questions, the way her mind worked through problems with elegant precision. Wanted to matter, not for his function, for himself. "I'd want to," he said, and felt the truth of it settle into his chest like an anchor. The change in the vestry's population became undeniable around the 83rd day. Bioluminescence throughout the structure had brightened to levels not seen since before the Traverse's collapse. Communication networks were reforming, not the old unified consciousness, but something new, something that honored individual thought while still permitting exchange and connection. Silmar presented the data to the Council with visible satisfaction. Cognitive plasticity across treated populations now exceeds baseline measurements from 15 cycles ago. We're not just recovering, we're adapting, evolving. The question, Orveth said, her tone thoughtful rather than challenging, is whether this adaptation is sustainable without continued treatment. There's only one way to determine that. Silmar's bioluminescence dimmed slightly. We suspend treatment and monitor for degradation. Kyle felt something twist in his chest at the suggestion. The sessions had become the architecture of his days, the rhythm that gave shape to his presence here. The thought of their absence created a hollowness he didn't want to examine too closely. But Silmar was right. If the Lear remained dependent on constant bioelectric stimulation, they hadn't truly recovered. They'd just transferred their reliance from the Traverse to him. The suspension began the next day. Sessions cancelled, contact limited to purely social interaction. The Lear's neural patterns left to maintain themselves without his chaos to provoke adaptation. The first week showed minimal decline. The second week showed none at all. By the third week it became clear the treatment had worked. Their minds had relearned plasticity, had integrated the ability to generate their own cognitive friction. They didn't need him anymore. Kyle stood in the empty treatment chamber on the 22nd day of suspension, feeling the absence of purpose like a physical weight. This was what he'd wanted, wasn't it? Evidence that the work had succeeded, that his contribution had mattered, that he'd helped restore function to a dying species. But the success felt hollow without the daily sessions to anchor it to. Without Silmar's hands against his shoulders, her careful questions, the hours of sustained presence that had somehow taught him what presence meant. He found her in the gardens, tending to her growing things with methodical precision. She looked up when he entered, her bioluminescence brightening in a way he'd learned to recognize as pleasure. "The treatment worked," he said without preamble. "You don't need the sessions anymore." "No." She set aside the tools she'd been using, giving him her full attention. "We don't." "So my contract is fulfilled. The work is complete." "Yes." She moved closer, her expression difficult to read. "Does that disappoint you?" The question cut to the core of something he'd been avoiding. "I don't know what I am without the work, without being useful." "You're Kale." She took his hands, the contact now familiar and grounding. "A human who learned how to be present, who chose connection even when it was difficult, who matters because of who you are, not what you do." "I'm not sure I know who that is yet." "Then stay and learn." Her grip tightened slightly. "Not as a contractor, not as a treatment provider, just as someone who belongs here. Someone who belongs with me." The offer hung between them, weighted with possibility and risk in equal measure. Staying meant choosing presence over absence, connection over isolation, the constant discomfort of being seen over the comfortable distance of pure function. It terrified him, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he let himself feel that terror instead of filing it away as irrelevant data. "I want to," he said, "but I don't know if I can be what you need. I don't need you to be anything." Silmar's bioluminescence pulsed with gentle certainty. "I just need you to be here, present, willing to try. Everything else we figure out together." Together. The word carried weight he'd never fully understood before, not merging into collective consciousness the way the Lear had with the Traverse, but choosing daily, repeatedly, to remain present with someone else, to let them see you, to let their presence matter. It was terrifying, and also, maybe, the most important work he'd ever do. "Okay," he said. "I'll stay." 6 months after the treatment suspension, the vestry held a gathering to formally celebrate cognitive restoration. The chamber that had once held 40,000 minds now hosted 300, their collective bioluminescence creating patterns of light that were beautiful precisely because they weren't synchronized. Kyle stood at the edge of the celebration, still uncomfortable with large social gatherings, but willing to be present for them now. Silmer found him there, as she always did, her presence both familiar and still slightly miraculous in its reliability. "They want you to speak," she said, gesturing to the assembled Lear, "to acknowledge your contribution to the recovery. I didn't do anything remarkable, just provided bioelectric interference. You taught us that chaos has value." She took his hand, interweaving their fingers with practiced ease. "That imperfection can be a strength. That consciousness doesn't require perfect harmony to flourish." He looked out at the gathering, at Lear, who had learned to think independently while still choosing connection, at Theris, composing music that blended traditional patterns with new innovations, at Orveth, whose combative approach to treatment had translated into leadership that valued productive disagreement, at Merle, who had started documenting the recovery process as a record for future Lear facing cognitive decline, and at Silmer, whose careful observation and unwillingness to let him disappear had somehow taught him that presence was possible, that mattering was possible, that he could be more than just useful. "I'm not good at speeches," he said. "Then don't make one." She squeezed his hand gently. "Just be here. That's enough." So he stood beside her while the celebration continued around them, his hand in hers, his consciousness finally aligned with his body in the same space and time. No longer performing presence, but actually experiencing it, the warmth of her touch, the complexity of collective joy around them, the solid reality of having chosen to stay, to connect, to matter. It wasn't comfortable, probably never would be, but it was real in a way nothing in his life had been real before. A Lear he didn't recognize approached, bioluminescence pulsing with curiosity. "Are you the human who saved us?" Kyle considered the question, feeling Silmer's attention on him, her quiet encouragement to answer honestly instead of deflecting. "No," he said finally. "I'm just the human who stayed." The Lear seemed puzzled by the distinction, but Silmer's bioluminescence brightened with something that looked like understanding. Pride, maybe, or love, in whatever form it took between a Lear and a human who had learned to be present together. Later, after the gathering dispersed and the vestry settled into its nightly quiet, they walked back to the quarters they now shared, a gradual integration that had happened naturally over weeks of choosing proximity over isolation. "Do you regret it?" Silmer asked as they prepared for sleep. "Staying here instead of returning to salvage work?" Kyle settled onto the bed form that had adapted to accommodate human physiology, watching her dim her bioluminescence to the soft glow she maintained during rest periods. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity, the clear parameters, knowing exactly what was expected. But I don't miss the absence." He reached for her hand, the gesture now automatic. "I don't miss operating while absent, performing without being present, being useful without mattering." She moved closer, her body's warmth a constant reminder of physical reality, of connection that couldn't be compartmentalized as pure function. "And now I'm learning that discomfort isn't the same as wrongness, that being present is work, but different work than I've done before." He met her eyes, holding the contact instead of deflecting. "Important work. The most important," she agreed softly. They lay in comfortable silence, her hand in his, two consciousnesses choosing proximity without merging, connection without losing themselves. Outside, the vestry hummed with the gentle activity of minds that had learned to think independently while still valuing communion. Kyle felt his awareness beginning to drift towards sleep, his nervous system finally relaxed enough to release conscious control. And in that liminal space between waking and dreams, he felt something he'd been absent from for so long he'd forgotten its existence. Contentment. Not because he was useful, not because he was needed, but because he was here, present, connected, choosing every day to stay and be seen and matter. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything.